Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue A Prophet in Babylon, Chapter 4, Storm Signals. The Sunday morning service at Mayfield Avenue Church had just concluded, and it was evident that something unusual had happened. Groups of people stood in the aisles and vestibules engaging in eager conversation. Deacon Roberts wore his most dangerous smile. It was characteristic of the man that when he smiled most was when he was most annoyed. Hawking, Small, and the other deacons had retired to the vestry, the door of which was shut. Everyone knew that they were in conclave. One lady, Mrs. Somerset, who enjoyed the reputation of being the best-dressed woman in the church, was observed bending over the book locker in her pew with a very flushed face. It was evident she was removing her books. When Margaret Gaunt came down the aisle, Mrs. Somerset moved towards her with a peremptory eagerness, and began to address her in a loud tone, without so much as offering her hand. Courtesy had never been Mrs. Somerset's strong point, and she made no pretense of it now. "I wish you good morning, Mrs. Gaunt," she said, with an angry nod. "It will be some time before we meet again." "Why, how's that?" said Margaret. "I thought you were not going to California this winter." "Nor am I. I expect to be in New York all winter, but I don't expect to enter this church again." "Oh, Mrs. Somerset," said Margaret in her sweetest manner, "you surely don't mean that. Why, what has happened?" "If you don't know, it would be no use my trying to inform you." Margaret flushed in spite of her self-control. It had been one of her chief duties as a minister's wife to cultivate self-control, and she had needed it more in her relations toward Mrs. Somerset than toward any other person in the church. For Mrs. Somerset was one of those unhappy, constituted women who were only able to believe in their own self-importance by assuring themselves of the insignificance of other people. She was by no means a vulgar person, but the possession of wealth had exaggerated her self-esteem to a degree that was intolerable. She could be flattered and cajoled into acts of considerable generosity, but generosity was neither indigenous nor spontaneous in her. She was the sort of woman of whom it was said, "It is well to keep upon her right side," which usually means that she is the kind of fractious child that must be bribed by sweetmeats to be good. Put her in the head of things, and no one could be sweeter tempered. Ignore her, and no one could be more spiteful. And so, although many fitter persons could have been found, Mrs. Somerset had long reigned supreme in the church clubs and similar organizations, and had even posed as an expert on literature, of which she knew nothing, and on the new theology, of which she knew even less. "I'm sure I'm not the least aware of any reason for your extraordinary conduct," said Margaret. "Unless," she added with a touch of delicate malice, "you've just discovered some frightful heresy in my husband's theology which contradicts your own." "Oh, it's not the theology, you know that very well," she retorted with an indignant rattle of her big gold bracelets. "I believe in the new theology, and all that, as you very well know. But when your husband tells us, as he told us this morning, that wealthy people are usually selfish, complacent, and unsympathetic, that they don't try to know the reality of life among the poor, and all that kind of nonsense, as if it were my business to go slumming, I, for one, feel insulted. If he loves the poor so much, he'd better go to them. Certainly I shall not stay to have them brought to me." "And did my husband really say all those dreadful things, Mrs. Somerset? If he did, I must have been asleep, for I never heard them. I will tell you what he did say, or what I thought he said, since your hearing seems to have been more acute than mine. He said the tendency of wealth was towards self-complacency, which is true enough. He said we were responsible for the poor, since the system of life we support creates them, which surely you don't deny. And he did say, I admit, that a church which was a social club, with everyone in it of one class, existing for its own gratification, was not exactly the kind of church Jesus Christ came to create. In what way can such statements be an insult to you? I'd really be glad to know." "Oh, it wasn't that altogether," she replied with her usual feminine skill of evading the point. It was his manner, the way in which he said it. It was positively offensive. And I know he looked straight at me as if he meant me. And then there was that dreadful story about a lumber camp at the end of the sermon, drunken men and Stanky's hymns, and all that sort of thing, so different from his usual sermons. It was outrageous, as if it had anything to do with us. I really didn't think your husband could be so coarse. His own sense might have told him it was out of place. Why, he quite ranted. And I've never been accustomed to such goings-on. And you never heard of a lumber camp in your life before? Why, how strange. I always thought your husband made his fortune out of lumber. I'm almost sure you told me so. Margaret could not for her life have resisted such a palpable hit. But it produced no effect except to increase the wrath of Mrs. Somerset, who with angry gestures grabbed her books together and swept out of the church. As Mrs. Somerset left the church, another of the church's ladies of a very different order approached Margaret. She was a white-haired, tall woman of very quiet manners and retiring disposition. She had had some great trouble in her early married life, of which no one knew the exact details. Whatever it was, it had broken her life and left her poor. She and Margaret had never met, except in casual ways. But Margaret, with her clear judgment, had long ago perceived Mrs. Holcomb's worth. More than once she had wished she knew her better, for in the calm, gracious face of the older woman there was a rare attractiveness which comes only from sorrowful experiences which have been spiritualized into disciplines, from obscure Calvaries out of whose torture and darkness the soul has attained a better resurrection. Will you pardon me if I confess that I heard all that Mrs. Somerset said, and I don't agree in a word of it, she began. I am only too delighted to hear you say so, said Margaret. I heard also every word your husband said, and I drank it in as one long athirst, who has found the waters. I have waited 7 years for this morning's sermon. I think I always knew it would come. At least I always believed it would. I should have left the church long ago, except for that belief. But I knew that your husband had not only a brilliant mind, but a big heart, and I felt that some day he must let his heart speak. His heart spoke this morning. Oh, encourage him to let it go on speaking. God has some great work for him to do, but he'll only do it by letting his heart guide him. Perhaps I ought not to say these things to you, but when I saw how you were being grieved by that foolish anger of the lady who had just gone out, I felt I must speak. The words were so lovingly spoken, with each sincerity and deep feeling, that for the moment Margaret's strong self-control forsook her. Her eyes filled with sudden tears. I can only thank you, she said, though I don't know quite whether I take your meaning. Won't you come and see me? I'm very sorry not to have known you better. Oh, it's not your fault, she answered. I've not wished to be known. I've led a very quiet life, with only my memories for company. As I have grown older, I fear I have grown less and less inclined to meet people, which is not quite a right state of feeling. You get to live almost entirely in the past when you live alone. The past is all that seems real. The present is a kind of dream. But today I felt for the first time for many years as if I were coming out of the past. The shadows are melting, and it has come to me that there may yet be something left for me to do before I die. I shall be very glad to know you better if you'll take me just as I am, a woman growing old whose life has had many sorrows, and has learned the hard lesson of resignation and renunciation. Margaret's heart went out to her, and in this rush of warm tenderness which she felt for this lonely woman, there was mingled a sharp and bitter reproach. Here was a woman whom no one had treated as of much account, Margaret among the number. It was women like Mrs. Somerset, who had moved in the high places of the church, demanded attention, absorbed notice, and all the time this woman with her sorrow and her character purified by sorrow had stood by, lonely and unloved. I shall be gladder than I can say to have you call upon me. But the phrase seemed too formal. To have you for my friend, she added. Then I will come. And at that moment there began one of those pure and deep friendships which are only possible between two persons of absolute sincerity. His heart had spoken. Mrs. Holcombe had used the right phrase in describing the sermon which John Gaunt preached that morning. It was a sermon so unlike anything that had preceded it, that it was little wonder if it had startled and offended his hearers. There had been none of the usual literary allusions in it, not a single quotation from a favorite author, not even a phrase that could be accounted as brilliant. The omissions were more remarkable because he had of late devoted his Sunday mornings to a criticism of Browning's philosophy of life. These addresses had excited unusual interest. Students had brought notebooks with them, and members of various literary clubs had been attracted by expositions which were undoubtedly competent and scholarly. Gaunt had delivered them with a view to publication. He was, in fact, already engaged in making a book out of them. But this morning the notebooks were unused. It was soon evident that nothing was to be said about Browning. He read a series of passages from the Gospels, in each one of which the Master appeared as surrounded by publicans and sinners. Who were these people, he asked. Quite clearly they were not reputable people, for everyone was surprised that Christ should associate with them. The general opinion was that Jesus had fallen into bad company. But what do we mean by bad company? We usually mean vicious people, and we think of them as a class by themselves. But vice is more equally distributed than we suppose. It is not confined to classes, and has no exclusive brand. Lustfulness and intemperance are vices, but so also are bad temper, meanness, selfishness, and inordinate pride. Jesus seems to have thought selfishness a much worse thing than folly. The worst people he knew were those whom the world thought the best. At all events, he spoke to them his most dreadful words of rebuke. But to other people, who were the foolish and wicked, but not unkind, he told tender stories about love and forgiveness. He did it not once or twice, but uniformly, so that he came to be known as the friend of publicans and sinners. The good people, of course, used the term in derision, but Jesus accepted it as a compliment. Was Jesus wrong? Of course, we dare not say that he was wrong, though many of us may think he was. In either case, he paid for his temerity with the cross, for it was the good people who put him to death. The publicans and sinners had no hand in the world's greatest tragedy. They could not have crucified their friend. But to the good people he was not a friend, but an enemy, and the chief reason why they hated him was because they knew that he saw through their pretense of goodness. So then it seems that if we would imitate Christ, as we say we wish to do, we have to find our friends among the despised people whom he loved, the publican and sinner. Do we know any persons answering this description? Do we wish to know them? Do we ever think of them? Have they ever entered this church? Or would we welcome them if they did? If Gaunt had stopped at that point, there would have been little sensation. So far he had only made general statements, and religious congregations are too well used to such statements to realize any personal implications in them. And as he spoke, he was perfectly aware of this. He knew not indeed for the first time, but for the first time with vivid realization, that Jesus of whom he spoke was to his hearers no more than the symbol of a sentiment, a Jesus of romance, with romantic ideas of love and justice, which no one supposed capable of interpretation in terms of ordinary conduct. It was even as Jesus had foreseen it would be through the ages. Men would praise his words, but would not do the things which he commanded them. An anguish of disdain seized upon Gaunt, disdain in part for himself that he had been so little in accord with the truths that he had just uttered, and in part with his hearers that they were manifestly pleased with truths which ought to have covered them with shame. For he knew, his long experience taught him, that if he were to stop with the picture he had drawn of the friend of the publican and sinners, not one of his hearers would be moved to any novel act of conduct. He foresaw that they would thank him for his sermon, praise it, say they were overjoyed in it, that dreadful phrase which puts the seal of entire futility upon preaching. His very soul sickened in him at the prospect. It came to him in a flash of blinding light that if ever he was to be sincere, he must be so now. He stood silent for several moments. His face was pale, but it was a kind of pallor that had a strange element of brightness in it. It suggested moonlight on snow. His hands were folded before him. His figure was rigid. The silence grew. It spread like a wave. Then there were uneasy movements and rustlings in the pews. Robert sat very upright, with lips half open. And then at the last Gaunt spoke, but the note of challenging disdain had gone out of his voice. He spoke quietly, but each word was surcharged with intensity. And through all there throbbed the note of pity. It had the effect of a sob in a singer's voice. Pity for himself that he had failed so long in his highest duty, and for others that they did not see what he beheld. He no longer drew a picture of something that happened centuries ago. He made his hearers feel that the same divine teacher who had dealt so tenderly with sinners and so rigorously with the proud and hard stood at that very moment in the midst of this conventionally Christian congregation. And then he told the story of Palmer's lumber camp hero, much as Palmer had related it to him. He pictured this weak little man, this despised Paradise Lost, with his ignorance of books and theologies, nursing drunken men through their nights of horror, indeflaggibly tender with his ministrations to those who derided him, sustained by one beautiful impulse, that he must needs do what his unseen friend had done and bade him to do. "Here is the true Christian," he cried. "Nay, not the Christian, but the Christ, one whose shoes latchet I am unworthy to unloose, one whom you and I, living competent lives of luxury, shall envy when the judgment comes. Your religion and mine has hitherto been only a gratification, never a sacrifice. It has been a sorry travesty of religion. It will never become a reality till it becomes a sacrifice." Words were given to him in that hour. He who had for 7 years read his little careful essays to eclectic congregations suddenly spoke with lips of flame. During the latter part of his address he seemed utterly unconscious both of himself and his audience, and so he did not see the angry flush on Mrs. Somerset's ample cheeks, nor the pale dismay on many other faces. One face was whiter than his own. It was Palmer's. The moment the address concluded, Palmer left the church. As if by preconcerted signal, at the close of the final hymn, the deacons gathered at the vestry door. Not one spoke to him, but as he passed the door on his departure from the church, he heard a murmur of voices behind that closed door. He knew that he was the subject of their discussion. And that's the end of Chapter 4. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 5, Dr. Jordan. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.